Erwin Rommel was a general whose legend seemed woven from the shimmering heat and endless space of the North African desert. His early, stunning victories created the myth of the Desert Fox, a brilliant tactician who could outmaneuver any opponent with audacious, lightning-fast armored thrusts. The world watched as his Afrika Korps swept across Cyrenaica, driving the British back towards the very gates of Egypt in a dizzying sequence of triumphs. This era of triumph fostered a dangerous illusion that military genius alone could win a war of global industrial attrition. Rommel himself was often at the very front, leading his panzers, fostering a cult of personality that masked the deeper, structural weaknesses of the Axis effort. He became a symbol of German military prowess, the antithesis of the static, trench warfare of previous conflicts, specializing in the war of motion. But even in these heady days of victory, the seeds of inevitable defeat were being sown thousands of miles away in the factories and shipyards of the Allies. The sheer distance from German supply ports meant his logistical tail was perpetually stretched to the breaking point, a constant source of anxiety for the meticulous commander. His early advances were always constrained, limited not by the British defense, but by the dwindling fuel gauges and the constant lack of replacement parts. The desert, which seemed to reward his audacity, was, in reality, a neutral and unforgiving accomplice to his ultimate failure. He knew that every victory, no matter how spectacular, came at a cost he could ill afford to pay, using up irreplaceable tanks and scarce petrol. The brilliance of his early campaign was merely a temporary postponement of the inevitable verdict that resources, not flair, would ultimately decide the conflict. The legend of Rommel was inspiring, yet it could not manufacture a single drop of gasoline or a single replacement tank for his increasingly exhausted divisions. His early successes were a thin veneer over a core military strategy that fundamentally failed to prioritize the North African theater with the necessary material support. The most critical realization began not with a defeat, but with the quiet, gnawing certainty that his initial, impossible gains could not possibly be sustained against the growing might of the British and American war machines. Rommel was a master of the war he had, but his enemies were masters of the war to come. He saw the mirage of triumph dissolve into the brutal arithmetic of a logistical imbalance that was growing wider every single day. His operational genius was running into the limits of physics and economics, a boundary even he, the Desert Fox, could not hope to breach. The illusion of permanent conquest faded as the supply convoys continued to sink. Rommel's most profound understanding was that the true master of the Desert War was not a general, but the harsh, unforgiving logistics of supply and transport. His famous quote, often cited as his ultimate realization, was that the campaign's fate was decided by the battle for the Mediterranean, not the battles on land. He recognized that the success or failure of the entire North African theater hinged upon the safe passage of German and Italian merchant ships, a passage increasingly dominated by the Royal Navy and the RAF. The enormous distance from the supply ports of Tripoli and Benghazi to the front lines required a colossal fleet of trucks, all consuming precious, lifeblood fuel. Fuel became the single most critical and most scarce resource, dictating the very possibility of maneuver, Rommel's greatest strength. He wrote repeatedly to his superiors, detailing the catastrophic impact of every sunken convoy, knowing that each loss was a permanent subtraction from his combat strength. The desert itself amplified the logistical challenge, turning every broken-down vehicle into a total loss and every mile of advance into a further strain on the supply chain. Rommel contrasted the constant, desperate scarcity of his own army with the inexorable, growing abundance of the British Eighth Army, a difference that became increasingly stark. He noted that the Allied forces could afford to sustain a high rate of attrition, confident in their virtually unlimited replacements of men and machinery. This realization meant accepting that the Axis was fighting a two-front war against the British, one against the soldiers and another against the relentless forces of British industrial output. The strategic reality became a simple equation: the Axis could not project power across the contested Mediterranean faster than the Allies could reinforce and supply their armies in Egypt. Rommel understood that the very environment, the vast, empty space that defined his maneuvers, was ultimately the greatest ally of his logistically superior enemy. The desert's emptiness mocked his small, finite resources and magnified the impact of every mechanical failure and every lost barrel of oil. His reports became less about the enemy's performance and more about the crushing inadequacy of his own supply lines, a cry for material support that never fully came. He saw the campaign as a slow, inevitable drain, a strategic bloodletting where the Axis bled material while the Allies only seemed to grow stronger. The true moment of realization was the moment he shifted from planning his next offensive to planning his next tactical retreat, driven solely by the fear of fuel exhaustion. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 was the point of no return, the military moment where Rommel's strategic realization was cemented by overwhelming tactical force. He was actually on sick leave in Germany when the massive British offensive, Operation Lightfoot, began, but he rushed back to a front line that was already collapsing under the weight of an unprecedented bombardment. The battle immediately devolved into a brutal, static slugfest, a kind of war that nullified Rommel's genius for movement and perfectly favored the Allied logistical supremacy. He was appalled by the scale of the British artillery fire, describing it as an immense, constant, and overwhelming hammer blow against his thinly held positions. Rommel understood that in a war of attrition, which El Alamein had become, the side with the most shells, the most tanks, and the most fuel always wins. He witnessed his veteran panzer divisions being systematically ground into dust, suffering losses that he knew, with chilling certainty, could not and would not be replaced. His famous communication to his staff after assessing the situation conveyed a sense of utter finality. He knew the battle was lost, and with it, the entire African campaign. The British could swap out a damaged tank crew and have a new Sherman back in the line within days, while every German tank lost was a permanent strategic deficiency. Rommel clearly recognized that he was not just defeated tactically, but was strategically bankrupt, his reserves of armor and fuel already completely exhausted. He was forced to make the painful decision to commit the very last of his reserves into a final, futile counterattack, a move of desperation rather than confidence. The tide had not just turned, it had become a colossal, irresistible wave of Allied industrial might crashing down upon the last Axis strongholds in Egypt. The sight of the fresh, massive columns of British armor convinced him that any further attempt to hold the line would result only in the complete annihilation of the Afrika Korps. His subsequent choice to begin a desperate, unauthorized retreat was a supreme act of military realism, prioritizing the survival of his men over a politically mandated, pointless martyrdom. Rommel knew that the Desert Fox had been outmatched not by a better commander, but by a superior war machine that had finally mobilized its full potential. The carnage at El Alamein was the physical embodiment of his most feared premonition, the proof that all his tactical brilliance could no longer compensate for his logistical poverty. The critical moment of Rommel's strategic realization was his open defiance of a direct, categorical order from Adolf Hitler himself, forcing him to choose between obedience and military sense. As the Axis line at Alamein crumbled, Hitler sent a frantic, uncompromising command that forbade any further retreat, demanding that the troops stand fast and fight to the last man. This order was a demand for martyrdom, a political decree for a heroic final stand that was utterly disconnected from the brutal reality of the battlefield. Hitler's message stated that a single foot of ground should not be yielded and demanded that the German soldier should fight, and if necessary, die in his position. Rommel immediately understood that following this directive would achieve nothing but the complete and senseless destruction of his remaining, vital fighting forces. He saw the order as proof that the political leadership in Berlin had completely lost touch with the grim realities of the African theater, prioritizing ego over strategy. His response was an act of profound courage and military integrity, as he quietly disregarded the order and continued to manage the difficult, grinding withdrawal. Rommel famously stated that he would not sacrifice his army to a senseless command, thereby elevating his duty to his soldiers above his duty to the Führer's delusional strategy. This defiance was his most powerful and clearest statement that the Desert Campaign was lost, an acknowledgement that all strategic hope had vanished. The Stand Fast order confirmed to Rommel that the enemy was no longer solely the British Eighth Army, but also the self-destructive, fanatical rigidity of his own supreme commander. He recognized that the last remaining goal was the preservation of his veteran troops to fight another day and perhaps be used in the defense of the European continent. Rommel knew that by retreating, he was signing his own death warrant in the eyes of Hitler, but he believed the survival of the Afrika Korps was of far greater strategic importance. The moral weight of the command was immense, forcing the general to become a strategist of survival rather than a conqueror. His continued, orderly withdrawal against explicit orders was the ultimate, non-verbal articulation of his realization: the North African theater was a lost cause, strategically untenable, and beyond saving. The fatal order only served to highlight the vast gulf between Rommel's clear-eyed realism and the Führer's dangerous, romanticized notion of warfare. The ultimate statement of loss was Rommel's analysis that the decisive battle was fought not on the dunes, but on the sea, with the total Allied dominance of the Mediterranean proving to be the campaign's logistical deathblow. He had repeatedly warned the High Command that the loss of air superiority and the relentless pressure from the Royal Navy and Allied submarines were strangling his army. The number of Axis supply ships sunk dramatically increased following the British success in interdicting the convoy routes and the introduction of better radar and anti-submarine capabilities. Rommel's reports began to cite the tonnage lost at sea as a more critical factor in the defeat than the number of tanks lost in combat. He accurately identified the British seizure of Malta and the strategic bombing of Axis supply ports as the pivotal, war-winning moves that doomed his efforts. The inability to safely transport fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles meant his combat units were in a state of perpetual degradation, a slow, inevitable march towards complete inoperability. Rommel contrasted his army, which was literally running on fumes and scavenging for spare parts, with the Allied forces, whose supply lines flowed freely and abundantly from across the ocean. He understood that he was engaged in a fight where one side could replace their losses instantly, while the other side was simply making a final draw from an empty bank account. The vast distance from the Italian ports to the front line became a deadly, interdicted gauntlet, turning every supply vessel into a high-risk gamble. Rommel saw the desert as a stage where the actors were slowly starving because the playwright, his own government, had failed to secure the passage of food. His most honest communication stated that the campaign could only be saved by a strategic commitment to securing the supply lines, a commitment that was never forthcoming. He recognized that the material foundation of his war was gone, shattered by the combined power of the Allied navies and air forces. The campaign's ultimate conclusion was the inevitable consequence of this logistical failure, proving that even the most brilliant general is powerless without the tools to fight. Rommel's dispatches and diary entries from the period after El Alamein are his bleakest and most professional statements, a written record detailing the catastrophic realization of the campaign's failure. His messages to Field Marshal Kesselring and Hitler's headquarters were stripped of all pretense of victory, focusing instead on stark, irrefutable statistics of material collapse. He wrote about the impossible differential in armor, noting that the enemy was constantly fielding fresh, new tanks while his own force was dwindling to a mere handful of battered, repaired machines. The reports detailed the critical shortages of motor transport, ammunition, and, most crushingly, gasoline, the essential element for his mobile style of warfare. Rommel was a general who prided himself on optimism and aggression, but his dispatches now carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a military realist reporting an inevitable end. He stated clearly that the Axis was entirely incapable of matching the Allied replacement rate, a strategic concession that was the ultimate admission of defeat. His communication was a desperate attempt to force the High Command to accept the facts on the ground and to authorize a complete, orderly withdrawal before total destruction occurred. The bleakness of his dispatch was his final, professional warning. Continued resistance would not be heroic, but merely a criminal waste of valuable German and Italian soldiers. He described the African forces as being worn out and crippled, a far cry from the proud Afrika Korps that had once terrorized the British across the dunes. Rommel highlighted the total air superiority of the Allies, which turned every movement during the day into a perilous, morale-destroying gamble. He saw the campaign now as a holding action, a desperate attempt to keep the Allied forces tied up, rather than a viable effort to win a strategic victory. The content of these dispatches confirms that Rommel's realization was based on a sober, systematic analysis of the power disparity, not a moment of emotional despair. His words were a prophecy, detailing the exact mechanisms by which the Axis forces would ultimately be annihilated, a detailed breakdown of inevitable defeat. The cruel reality of uncompensated attrition became Rommel's most visceral statement of loss, a daily anguish of seeing his army slowly bleed out with no prospect of replenishment. He was a master of the maneuver, designed to defeat the enemy while preserving his own forces, but he was forced into a grinding battle of sustained losses he could not mitigate. Every engagement, regardless of the outcome, chipped away at his finite pool of trained men and specialized equipment, a loss that proved permanent. Rommel observed the immense, inexhaustible pool of manpower and tanks available to the British, American, and Commonwealth forces, a contrast that highlighted his own hopeless position. He noted that the Allied command could afford to treat their losses as a temporary inconvenience, while his losses were an irreversible decline towards total operational failure. The German war machine, focused on the Eastern Front, was simply unable and unwilling to feed the African theater with the necessary steady stream of replacements. Rommel understood that even his most brilliant tactical victories were becoming strategic losses, as the cost in fuel and material outstripped the limited gains. The desert was littered with the hulks of his unrecoverable tanks, a constant, physical reminder of the campaign's failure to sustain itself. He recognized that the battle had moved beyond the realm of tactical genius and into the cold, hard realm of sheer manufacturing output and strategic resource allocation. His command became less about fighting the enemy and more about managing an ongoing, controlled disassembly of his army, desperately trying to save the pieces. The realization of attrition meant accepting the fact that even if he won every small skirmish, he would inevitably lose the larger war of numbers and material output. Rommel's final decision to retreat was the ultimate testament to this reality, a recognition that the only way to avoid the total loss of his army was to escape the field entirely. He had become the manager of a slow, inevitable military catastrophe, forced to watch the material foundations of his once triumphant command crumble daily. The constant, UN-replaced losses were the true, devastating voice of the desert, finally speaking the language of defeat. The Great Retreat from El Alamein was Rommel's most dramatic action-based statement of loss, a masterpiece of defensive withdrawal that simultaneously acknowledged the campaign's utter failure. This 1,000-mile journey across North Africa was a desperate race against the clock and the pursuing British Eighth Army, a move designed purely for the preservation of his exhausted forces. Rommel personally oversaw the constant, arduous process of leapfrogging defensive positions, keeping his battered army always just one step ahead of total encirclement. The retreat required the painful abandonment of immense stockpiles of supplies and, tragically, hundreds of wounded soldiers who could not be transported in the desperate rush. He understood that he was no longer a conqueror but a masterful escape artist, fighting for the lives of his men rather than for strategic objectives. The movement was conducted under the constant, demoralizing harassment of the Allied Desert Air Force, which turned every road into a gauntlet of bombing and strafing. Rommel's reports described the immense fatigue of his veteran troops, who were now fighting not for victory, but for mere survival against the crushing heat and the relentless enemy pressure. The retreat was the physical manifestation of his strategic surrender, a clear sign that the Axis was no longer capable of holding any significant territory in North Africa. He knew that every mile gained westward was a mile closer to the final, inevitable cornering of his army against the shores of the Mediterranean. His decision to retreat demonstrated a ruthless military realism, a willingness to sacrifice territory and reputation to save his invaluable fighting men from pointless destruction. The desert, which had once been his open playground for maneuver, now became a vast, unforgiving treadmill, relentlessly pushing his defeated forces towards their doom. Rommel's mastery of the retreat confirmed his tactical brilliance but simultaneously solidified his strategic realization that the war in Africa had been irrevocably lost. He wrote that the pursuit was like running a marathon while carrying a dead weight, a vivid metaphor for the hopelessness of his position. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, in February 1943, provided a final, brilliant, yet ultimately hollow tactical victory that confirmed Rommel's overarching strategic pessimism. This engagement saw the Desert Fox launch a devastating counterattack against inexperienced American forces, achieving a spectacular localized victory and temporarily routing the opposition. The success demonstrated that Rommel's tactical genius remained undimmed, capable of delivering a shocking blow even with his severely depleted resources. However, Rommel himself immediately understood that this triumph was a mere illusion, a momentary bright spot that did nothing to alter the fundamental balance of power. He noted that the Americans quickly reinforced the sector, pouring in massive amounts of fresh troops and modern equipment to immediately contain the breach. Rommel's most telling statement was his observation that the small victory only cost him irreplaceable fuel and ammunition that he could not afford to expend. The sight of the huge, freshly arrived American forces confirmed his long-held fear about the limitless reserves and industrial might of the new superpower arrayed against him. He realized that even a crushing local defeat for the Allies was instantly absorbed and mitigated by their superior manufacturing capability, a luxury the Axis did not possess. The battle was a powerful but ultimately tragic demonstration that individual military brilliance could no longer overcome the overwhelming material deficit. Kasserine was the last offensive operation Rommel would command in North Africa, a final, brilliant flash before the inevitable, suffocating darkness of defeat. His subsequent recommendation to abandon the Tunisian bridgehead altogether was a direct result of the Kasserine battle, an acknowledgement that further fighting was fruitless. Rommel understood that the Allies had been surprised, but they had learned quickly, and the theatre was now completely flooded with insurmountable numbers of men and machines. The short-lived triumph served only to hasten his final, inescapable conclusion that the Desert War had strategically ended weeks ago at El Alamein. The final phase of the campaign, with Rommel's army cornered in the Tunisian bridgehead, was the physical embodiment of his realization that the desert was completely lost. His forces were now trapped between the relentless pursuit of the British Eighth Army from the east and the freshly landed American and British forces of Operation Torch from the west. The Axis control of the Mediterranean was entirely gone, meaning the supply situation was no longer critical, but utterly terminal, with only a trickle of essential materials arriving. Rommel described the situation as being like a cornered animal, facing overwhelming odds with no viable route for escape or maneuver. The total air superiority of the Allies became a constant, demoralizing presence, turning every movement and every exposed position into a target. He spent his final days in command fighting a desperate, defensive battle, completely opposite to the aggressive, mobile warfare that had made him famous. Rommel's reports from Tunisia detailed the slow, inch-by-inch strangulation of his command, reporting the final, irreversible loss of combat power. He understood that the battle had moved from a question of if they would be defeated to merely a question of when the final surrender would occur. His clear-eyed assessment concluded that the Tunisian defensive line was only delaying the inevitable, and every day spent holding it was a day of wasted resources and lives. Rommel was a general who loved the freedom of the open desert, and the confines of the Tunisian coast were the ultimate psychological and strategic prison. The sense of hopelessness in his final communications was palpable, a testament to the fact that his tactical genius had been fully exhausted by the overwhelming material odds. He stated that the campaign's end was predetermined by the disastrous political and strategic decisions made far away from the front lines. The cornered position of his army in Tunisia was the final, tragic statement that the dream of Axis victory in North Africa was dead, sealed by the Mediterranean. Rommel's final, most direct and strategic statement of realization was his urgent, desperate recommendation for the immediate and total evacuation of all Axis troops from Tunisia. He saw the continued commitment of men and material to the doomed North African theatre as a suicidal waste of resources that should be conserved for the defense of the European continent. His warnings to Hitler were not just about the loss of Africa, but about the clear strategic consequence of that loss, an inevitable Allied invasion of Italy or southern Europe. Rommel argued that the veteran troops of the Afrika Korps were far more valuable defending the home front than being annihilated in a meaningless, isolated bridgehead. He correctly prophesied that the total Allied dominance of the Mediterranean, cemented by the African victory, made a cross-sea invasion of Europe a certainty. His plea for evacuation was the clearest possible indication that Rommel had completely written off the African campaign as a strategic asset. He understood that the political imperative to hold ground was costing Germany an entire elite army, a loss that would cripple its ability to resist the coming invasions. Rommel's final act in Africa was to attempt to salvage the remaining fighting power, prioritizing the long-term defense of the Reich over the short-term political face-saving. The refusal of Hitler and the High Command to heed this warning proved to Rommel that his analysis was correct, but that his influence had tragically evaporated. He realized that his superiors were committed to fighting a psychological war of image and will, even when the actual material war was already irretrievably lost. Rommel's recall from Africa in March 1943, officially for health reasons, was in reality the final military acknowledgement that his vision of inevitable defeat was accurate. He left the continent convinced that the strategic error was not a tactical mistake on his part, but a massive, fatal misallocation of resources by the German High Command. Rommel's final, enduring assessment of the Desert Campaign was a cold, objective conclusion: the war was lost because it became a war of resources, a competition the Axis could never win. He famously stated that it was the American economy, not the British Army, that ultimately defeated him in North Africa, a stunning admission of the power of Allied industry. Rommel's strategic genius was rendered obsolete by the sheer, crushing weight of overwhelming industrial output pouring into the British and American supply lines. He saw the campaign as a tragic illustration of modern warfare, where a small tactical advantage is quickly drowned by an ocean of enemy material superiority. His statements confirmed that the age of the purely brilliant commander was being replaced by the era of total war, where economics held the final, irreversible veto power. Rommel understood that the Axis had gambled on a quick, decisive victory that never materialized, and once the war became a sustained commitment, their defeat was a foregone conclusion. He accurately reported that the quantity, quality, and reliability of the Allied equipment were constantly improving, while his own forces were fighting with dwindling stocks and aging machines. The ultimate words of the Desert Fox confirmed that the fate of the Afrika Korps was sealed in the shipyards and factories of the United States and Great Britain. His realism about the material deficit was his most powerful and lasting contribution to the analysis of the North African defeat. Rommel's final, heartbreaking statement was the realization that the desert was lost long before the final shots were fired, already decided by the imbalance of resources flowing across the Atlantic. He knew that the sand of North Africa was merely the vast stage for the military execution of an economic defeat. The final surrender of the Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943 was simply the inevitable, tragic conclusion of the logistical failure that Rommel had foreseen and documented 6 months earlier.